Fruitful Living with Sissel Anderson. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey, and this morning on Fruitful Living with Sissel Anderson, going to be talking about, well, the second reading from this past weekend, focusing on death. It's been kind of a topic we've been sticking to. Well, the name or the title of today's show is Make It a Joyful Death. So there we have it. Good morning, Sissel.
Good morning, Keith. It is wonderful to be with you here on this Ash Wednesday to talk about our favorite topic, which is death.
Yeah.
If you're like me, maybe this last weekend you were sitting in Mass and the second reading comes about and St. Paul just kind of goes off a little bit and he's just like, he just comes on very strong, saying very strong statements that you're like, wow, okay, all right. If I'm going to recall everyone's memory a little bit, but it's brothers and sisters, when this which is corruptible clothes itself with incorruptibility, and this which is mortal clothes itself with immortality, then the word that is written shall come about. Death is swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? There's more, but I want to leave it there for a minute. But I feel like whenever you hear that, everyone in like the pews kind of straighten up. They're like, okay, we're getting serious here. There's a lot of great things about this whole passage, and then the second part of the passage that we'll read in a minute. But I think we have to take a moment to establish when you hear something like this. Some people probably sitting in the pews, and I know it's been myself before. And when you hear that, you're like, I don't know, I've felt the sting of death before. Would you ever have that reaction, Keith, if you heard this?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm really thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, I've definitely had that sting of death. I obviously have not passed away, but I've had family members and
for everyone on this program has not experienced like the sting of death that way. No. Right. But more like a friend or family member passing away. It kind of brought me back 6 years when I was listening to this, because my mom passed away 6 years ago this past Monday, and she passed away the Sunday before the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. And so this was the reading on that day in Mass. We found out she passed away in the middle of the night on Saturday. And so we went to Mass the next day. And you're sitting there with a lot of thoughts, a lot of grief. And when the second reading, I was kind of tuned out of most of the Mass. I'm going to be honest. It was not my most attentive Mass. And I think that's understandable. But that reading came out, and I hear, the words, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? And I kind of sat there going, maybe I'm broken or something, but I'm kind of feeling a little stingy. I don't know. This is a few hours after, my mom has passed away. It felt weird. I wasn't mad. I just felt weird. I was like, I feel the sting. But I think the second part of the passage, which honestly on that day I tuned out more than anything, but it kind of comes around and explains, why the sting of death is gone. Not that we don't feel anything, but why the sting of it is gone. And it says, St. Paul continues and says, the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And in the moment of grief, that's not going to be the part that you're probably going to focus in on. But it's an important part to note, is that the reason why death loses its sting, its lasting sting, is because it's not lasting. It's because God is going to raise us up, and we're going to be better than we ever were here on earth. We're going to become full. Thanks be to God. I don't know how familiar you are with Buddhist teachings, and I'm not that familiar myself, but I think there's a distinction. I saw a video Chris Stefanik did about this, of how they view overcoming death, or, leaving death, is because they kind of losing themselves, because they become one with, and they might reincarnate. But we overcome death in that we get to go up to death and say, you didn't win. I did. Not because of anything I did, but because of my God. And so it's a very different way that we look at life and look at death. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts from this past weekend with this this reading, which again, obviously very intentional to happen right before we start Lent. It's Ash Wednesday. Maybe some of you are on your way right now to go to Mass to get your ashes. I'm going to do that later today. And what does the priest say? Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. When he puts those on your forehead, and I don't know, it's really beautiful. It's hard because again, we're living life here on earth where there is that separation of death, and it makes things, makes it hard. But when we remember that God gave us victory through Jesus Christ, then the sting of death is just simply because of the sin in the world that we have.
Yeah, it makes me think those who don't reflect on death and really try to avoid it, maybe they're not Catholic, maybe they're not Christian, or maybe they are, they just want to avoid it completely. Do you think that maybe they really do feel the sting of death when it happens to happen within their family or friend realm?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways, I think, depending on the person. There is something very common today. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, Keith, but when someone dies, more and more, especially some Protestant denominations will do this because they're not going to have like a mass like we do. They will have more often than not, they might not even have a funeral, if that makes sense, but they have something called a celebration of life.
Oh, yeah.
And that is something beautiful. I want to make sure it's clear. So having a celebration of life, not a bad thing. Sure. However, we are sometimes missing the remembering that it's okay to spend that time in mourning and in grief about the death, and that death happened. Then we are joyous in the hope of the resurrection. But more often than not, we want to skip over that. We don't want to even ponder on the death. We want to talk about, oh, this person was amazing, and all the great things they did. We miss that very key step, which is kind of similar, like when we go through the season of Lent, you have to go through the season of Lent, which is long and it's hard and it's really hard. But on the other end of it, we then get to celebrate Easter. We get to celebrate this joyous season and feast. But it's really, God has set that up very clearly, that there is the mourning and then there's the celebrating. And so that's one way I've definitely seen nowadays. And then there's some people who have a hard time getting over death in the family or a friend because they don't have that hope of the resurrection, that they are just, it's hard. You're like, they're just like, wow, just another horrible thing that's happened in this life, and I guess got to move on. But it's really difficult, and they can't fully recover from that. Whereas, not that it's easy, but we who have this hope in the resurrection are able to go, okay, I'm so sad about losing this person and having this person's wisdom in my life and just their companionship. But I know that my God has conquered death, and I get to see them again.
Yeah. You've got a pulse on Gen Z. I mean, you have your group there. Do you feel like your generation has maybe a greater grasp on the levity of death but also the hope of what are things to come, and obviously with being able to share the fruits in heaven? Or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. Gen Z, I've said before, they're kind of notorious for having dark senses of humor. So I think they talk about death a lot more, and that they're, I don't think it's the most authentic in the best way always, but it's better than just kind of ignoring that death is a thing, and kind of pretending everything's fine and celebrate life and, nothing bad's ever going to happen. Whereas they're like, no, everything bad's going to happen, and that's just how life is. Haha. There's a little bit of an in between. So I appreciate the forwardness and the candor when it comes to death, because we can laugh in the face of death. Like we can, only because of God. But we can, but sometimes I think it's more coming from a place of self-deprecating and and not quite from the I have confidence in Jesus, but so right. That's kind of like what I've observed from Gen Z. If you ever take any minute to watch any YouTube videos or like read any memes, that's kind of the vibe that you get overall. And it's funny because I don't even realize sometimes that I have that Gen Z influence, because my brother and I, who are both Gen Z, will make a joke, and my sister, who's a millennial, will just be like, I don't get it. Like, she's she's just like, I don't think I get this humor. So, yeah, that's kind of what I felt. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that on the internet.
Yeah, I've seen the word being changed, like from death to unalive.
Oh,
so
yeah.
like using it as a verb, or it's just really interesting how the younger generation talks about death. And on one end, kind of like what you were saying, it's kind of inspiring because it's focused on more than, say, millennials. I know we tend to kind of avoid certain topics that may include friction, which death is kind of a friction there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can appreciate that. Now, talking on Ash Wednesday, what is your favorite part about Ash Wednesday?
Ooh, that's a good question. I love that the first day of Lent is this day of fasting and abstinence, because if we didn't have that, I think it would be really easy for us to almost miss the start of Lent and properly set ourselves up, where when you are maybe hungry between your little small meals or whatever you're doing for fasting, and you're like, oh man, I'm kind of missing bacon right now. It's a great opportunity for us to actually take a moment and be like, okay, Lent is starting. I need to get serious about this. And Lord, how do you want me to grow closer to you in this season? So that's one of my favorite things, is that we have a very very physical things, in that we're abstaining and fasting, and then we get these ashes on our forehead. Because I love when the faith connects very physical things, because it's a good reminder, a tangible reminder of what we're doing in the season that we're entering into.
Well said. Well, we're certainly looking forward to embarking on Ash Wednesday. I know, like you said, you're going to get ashes a little bit later today, as will the rest of us. I know we're doing the early morning show, so we aren't able to make it for the early mornings. But those listening out there, we're excited for you if you're going to Ash Wednesday services or masses. But thanks again, Sissel, for joining us this morning. You can also catch Sissel on Back to the Father. She helps produce that show. It's Friday afternoons, 1 p.m. Central, on GRN Online's YouTube channel. So make sure to search for that. And hey, if you want to call in on The Quest a little bit later this afternoon, 4 p.m. Central, Sissel helps a lot with that show as well. So stay tuned for that. And that is the end of our first hour. If you are about to get your ashes this morning, make sure to wear those ashes proudly for the rest of the day. Don't be shy, because obviously a lot of people aren't thinking about death. But hey, if that's the case, we have the second hour ready for you, either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube and Rumble. So for those leaving, we'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Central, 7 a.m. Eastern. Make it a joyful day. Otherwise, if you're sticking around, hang tight. We've got a whole another hour ready just for you. We'll be right back.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.